The lobby buzzed with life, heels clicking against polished floors, voices blending into a symphony of corporate chatter. Walter Gaines pushed a cleaning cart through the crowd, his faded uniform dull against the sleek glass walls. No one looked at him. Not once. He had built this company on principles of respect and equality, but now, walking these halls as a janitor, he felt the weight of something broken, a culture he no longer recognized. A young intern dropped a stack of papers near his cart. Walter bent to help, but she snatched them up quickly, her eyes darting away. "I've got it," she mumbled, hurrying off without a second glance. Walter straightened slowly, gripping the cart's handle tighter. 20 years ago, he would have stopped her, asked her name, encouraged her. Now he was just part of the scenery. Near the elevators, two executives stood laughing. "Did you see the new hires?" one said with a smirk. "HR's scraping the bottom of the barrel." Walter paused mid-step, his jaw tightening. Their words weren't just careless. They were a symptom of something deeper. A security guard passed by and nodded at him. "Long day?" Walter forced a small smile. "Always." The guard chuckled lightly before walking off. Even he didn't recognize me. The disguise was working too well. As Walter turned a corner, Megan Trask's voice cut through the air like a blade. "They're lucky we let them in the building," she sneered. Elliot Drayton laughed in response, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed down the hallway. Walter stopped for a moment, his grip tightening on the cart's handle. He pushed, forward slowly but with purpose. The break room door was slightly ajar, letting the sound of laughter spill into the hallway. Walter paused outside, his cleaning cart parked against the wall. Inside, Megan Trask leaned against the counter, her voice sharp and cutting. "They're lucky we let them in the building," Megan said, smirking as she stirred her coffee. "Elliot," Drayton chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You're not wrong. Some of them don't even belong here." Walter's grip tightened on the cart handle. Their words weren't just careless banter. They were a window into a culture that thrived on exclusion, Megan continued, her tone dripping with arrogance. "The janitors especially. Have you seen them? Half of them don't even speak English." Elliot laughed louder this time, shaking his head. "HR's really scraping the bottom of the barrel these days." Walter stepped closer to the door, his heart pounding quietly in his chest. He had built this company to be different, to be better. But listening to them now, he realized how far it had fallen. Inside, Megan glanced at her watch and sighed dramatically. "I have a meeting with Denise Carter later. She's so aggressive, it's exhausting." Elliot rolled his eyes. "She's always trying too hard." Walter exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to relax around the cart handle. He pushed it forward down the hallway, leaving their laughter behind him, but carrying their words with him, like a weight. The hallway stretched ahead, quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Walter pushed his cart slowly, his thoughts heavy with the words he'd just overheard. Megan's laughter still echoed faintly in his mind. As he turned the corner near the break room, Megan Trask stepped out abruptly, her phone pressed to her ear. Walter's cart bumped into her side, causing her coffee cup to tilt precariously. She pulled back sharply, glaring at him as though he'd committed a crime. "Watch where you're going," Megan snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. Walter paused, his hands steady on the cart. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his tone calm but deliberate. Megan narrowed her eyes, scanning him from head to toe as if she were assessing his worth. "Do you even speak English?" she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him to hear but quiet enough to pretend it wasn't meant for him. Walter met her gaze briefly before lowering his eyes. "I'll be more careful," he replied evenly, his voice carrying no anger, just quiet restraint. Her arrogance clashed against his calmness, a quiet power she didn't recognize. Megan scoffed and adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "They'll hire anyone these days," she muttered as she walked away, leaving Walter standing alone in the hallway. Walter watched her retreating figure for a moment before gripping the cart's handle again. This wasn't just about one person. It was about uncovering how deep the rot went. He pushed forward slowly but with purpose. Walter stood still for a moment, his cart parked in the middle of the hallway. Megan's scoff lingered in the air, sharp and dismissive, cutting deeper than her words. "They'll hire anyone these days," she had muttered as she walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Her words weren't just careless. They were a reflection of something deeper, something systemic. This wasn't just arrogance. It was entitlement built on years of unchecked power. He watched her retreating figure, her posture upright, her confidence unshaken. Employees passed by without noticing him, their heads down, their focus elsewhere. Megan didn't look back. Walter exhaled slowly, gripping the handle of his cart tighter. This wasn't just about one person. It was about uncovering how far this culture had drifted from the values he'd built it on. A junior employee hurried past him, glancing briefly at Megan before shaking her head and muttering under her breath, "Typical." Walter caught the word but said nothing, his expression unreadable. The hallway grew quieter as Megan disappeared around the corner. Walter leaned against his cart for a moment, his eyes scanning the polished floors and sleek walls of the building he had created. It was spotless on the surface, but beneath it lay cracks that couldn't be ignored any longer. He straightened up and pushed the cart forward again, his steps deliberate but slow. The sound of wheels rolling against tile filled the silence as Walter whispered to himself, "Let's see how far this goes." Walter paused near the end of the hallway, his cart parked against the wall. The building was quiet now, the rush of employees fading as meetings began behind closed doors. He leaned against the cart, his eyes scanning the space around him, the polished floors, the sleek glass walls, the faint hum of fluorescent lights. This was his creation, a company, built on promises of equality and respect, but somewhere along the way, those promises had been buried beneath arrogance and entitlement. He glanced toward the corner where Megan had disappeared minutes ago, her scoff still ringing in his ears. "They'll hire anyone these days," she had said, her tone dripping with disdain. Walter clenched his fists briefly before releasing them, forcing himself to stay calm. A janitor passed by, nodding politely as he carried a mop bucket toward the supply closet. Walter nodded back, watching him disappear into the shadows. He had once known every employee's name, their stories, their struggles. But now, they were just faces in a crowd. Walter straightened up and adjusted his cart. His movements were slow but deliberate, his resolve hardening with each step he took. As he pushed the cart forward again, he whispered to himself, "Let's see how far this goes." His voice was quiet but steady, a promise more than a question. This wasn't just an investigation anymore, it was a reckoning. The wheels of the cart rolled smoothly against the tile as Walter moved deeper into the building, his mind racing, with questions that needed answers. The room was small, the kind of space where dreams felt both fragile and infinite. A younger Walter Gaines stood at the front, his sleeves rolled up, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This company will treat everyone with respect," Walter said, looking directly at the handful of employees gathered before him. "No matter their role, their background, everyone deserves dignity." The group nodded, some smiling faintly, others clapping softly. In the back of the room stood Hector Ortega, a janitor with calloused hands and tired eyes. He met Walter's gaze and gave a small nod of approval. Back then, it wasn't just a promise. It was a mission. He believed in it with everything he had. The memory faded, replaced by the cold sterility of the present. Walter now pushed a cleaning cart down a sleek hallway lined with glass walls and polished floors. Employees brushed past him without so much as a glance, their conversations blending into a dull hum. A young executive bumped into him, spilling coffee on Walter's sleeve. "Watch it!" the man snapped before walking off without waiting for a response. Walter wiped his sleeve, silently, his jaw tightening. 20 years ago he had promised respect. Now he was invisible in his own empire. He paused near a conference room where Megan Trask's sharp laugh cut through the air. "They're lucky we let them in the building," she said to a colleague, her tone dripping with disdain. Walter's grip tightened on the cart handle as he turned away slowly. The promise he made felt like a distant echo, and it was time to bring it back. The faint squeak of a mop echoed through the hallway. Walter stood at the edge of the break room, his cleaning cart parked beside him. Inside, Luis Ortega, a janitor in his late 40s, wiped up a spill near the coffee machine. His movements were steady but tired, his shoulders slightly hunched. Megan. Trask walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She glanced at Luis and frowned. "You missed a spot," she said curtly, pointing at the floor. Luis paused, his hand tightening around the mop handle. "I'll get it," he replied quietly, not looking up. Megan sighed dramatically. "Honestly, how hard is it to mop a floor?" she muttered as she poured herself a coffee. Walter's jaw tightened as he watched from the doorway. She didn't see him as a person, just another cog in the machine she thought she controlled. Another employee walked in, glanced at Luis, then quickly looked away. The silence in the room was heavy, complicit. Luis straightened up and moved to another corner of the room without a word. Megan took a sip of her coffee and smirked slightly. "Lazy," she muttered under her breath as she walked out, her heels clicking louder than before. Walter stepped into the room as Luis wrung out the mop in the bucket. "You okay?" Walter asked softly. Luis nodded, but didn't meet his eyes. "It's fine," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't fine. It had never been fine. But silence was easier than fighting a system that didn't care. Walter picked up his cart and left quietly, but Megan's words stayed with him like a stain that wouldn't wash away. The meeting room buzzed with muted energy, the air thick with unspoken hierarchies. Walter sat near the back, his janitor's uniform blending into the shadows. His cleaning cart was parked discreetly outside the door, but his eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. Denise Carter, a mid-level manager, adjusted her notes nervously before speaking. "I think we should focus on streamlining the client onboarding process," she said, her voice steady but cautious. Elliot Drayton leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He didn't look at Denise as she spoke, but glanced at another colleague, a younger white man seated across from her. Moments later, Elliot cleared his throat. "That's an interesting idea," he said, turning to the younger man. "What do you think about implementing something similar?" The man nodded quickly, repeating Denise's exact suggestion almost word for word. Elliot smiled approvingly and said, "That's what I'm talking about. Clear and actionable." Denise froze, her jaw tightening as she stared at her notes. She had spent hours refining that idea, only to watch it be handed off like it wasn't hers. Walter scribbled something in his logbook, his pen pressing harder against the paper than usual. It wasn't just dismissal, it was erased. Denise tried to speak again, but Elliot interrupted smoothly. "Let's move on to the next point." The room shifted uneasily. A few glances exchanged, but no words spoken. Walter leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The silence wasn't just complicity, it was protection for those who thrived within the system. Walter stood, quietly as the meeting ended, his resolve hardening with every step he took toward his cart. The break room was empty except for the faint hum of the vending machine. Luis Ortega sat at the corner table, his lunch untouched. Walter entered quietly, carrying a mop, but paused when he saw Luis staring blankly at the wall. "You good?" Walter asked, his voice soft but deliberate. Luis hesitated before shrugging. "Yeah, just tired." Walter pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Tired of what?" Luis let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Of this," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room, "of being invisible until someone needs something cleaned up." Walter leaned forward slightly. "Have you ever reported it? The way they treat you?" Luis's expression hardened as he looked at Walter for the first time. "To who?" asked sharply. "HR. They work for them." There was no anger in Luis's voice, just exhaustion, the kind that came from years of being ignored. "They don't listen," Luis continued, his tone flat now. "I've seen complaints disappear, like they were never filed. You speak up and suddenly you're difficult. Or worse, you're gone." Walter nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "That doesn't make it right," he said quietly. Luis sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Right doesn't matter here," he muttered. "Keeping your head down does." The room fell silent except for the faint buzz of the vending machine. Walter stood after a moment, picking up his mop again. Luis wasn't defeated, he was surviving the only way he knew how. As Walter walked away, Luis called out softly, "Thanks for asking." Walter didn't turn around but nodded once before disappearing into the hallway. The office was silent, the glow of the computer screen casting shadows across Walter's face. He sat at the desk, his janitor's uniform blending into the dim light. In front of him lay a stack of HR files, their edges worn and dusty from neglect. Walter opened the first folder, his hands steady, but his chest tightening. Inside was a complaint filed by Denise Carter 2 years ago. Dismissed due to lack of evidence. The words were stamped in bold red ink across the top. It wasn't lack of evidence. It was lack of accountability. He flipped through more files, each one telling the same story. Luis Ortega had reported Megan Trask for public humiliation 3 times in the past year. All 3 complaints were marked resolved. Walter's jaw clenched as he read Megan's response. Miscommunication. No harm intended. The next file was about Elliot Drayton, accused of dismissing ideas from minority employees during meetings. Walter scanned the notes. Employee. Feedback inconclusive. These weren't misunderstandings. They were patterns, and patterns didn't disappear. They were buried. Walter leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply as he stared at the growing pile of folders on the desk. The weight of each story pressed against him like a silent accusation. He opened one last file, a complaint from Hector Ortega, Luis's father, filed nearly 20 years ago. It described similar treatment: dismissal, humiliation, invisibility. Walter froze as he read the final note. Retired early. Case closed. This wasn't negligence. It was complicity, and it had been happening for decades. Walter closed the file slowly and stood, his resolve hardening with every step he took, toward the door. The office party was in full swing, the room filled with laughter and clinking glasses. Walter stood near the corner, his janitor's uniform blending into the background. He held a mop handle loosely, his eyes scanning the crowd. Denise Carter stood at the center of a small group, her voice steady but cautious as she presented an idea. "I think our team should focus on integrating client feedback directly into the design process," she said, her tone measured but confident. Megan Trask smirked from across the room, swirling her drink lazily. "That's a little aggressive, don't you think?" she said loudly enough for others to hear. Denise paused, her shoulders stiffening slightly. "I don't think it's aggressive. I think it's proactive." Elliot Drayton stepped in smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Proactive is good, but maybe we should tone it down a bit," he said, glancing at Megan for approval. Moments later, Elliot repeated Denise's exact suggestion to another group nearby, earning nods of agreement and murmurs of praise. Megan laughed lightly and said, "Now that makes sense." Denise stood frozen, her jaw tightening as she stared at her drink. Her words had been stolen, packaged neatly, and handed off like they'd never belonged to her. Walter watched silently from the corner, his fists tightening around the mop handle. It wasn't just dismissal. It was erasure. The room buzzed with conversation as Denise quietly excused herself, walking toward the break room with hurried steps. Walter followed slowly, his expression unreadable, but his heart pounding with quiet fury. The break room was dimly lit, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Denise Carter sat at the small table, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee cup. Her shoulders were hunched, her usually composed demeanor unraveling. Walter stepped in quietly. his mop in hand. He paused when he saw her, his presence unnoticed at first. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the stillness. Denise looked up sharply, her eyes red but defiant. "I'm fine," she said quickly, but her voice cracked on the last word. Walter didn't move, his gaze steady but gentle. "You don't look fine," he said after a moment. Denise exhaled shakily, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "Do you ever feel like no matter how hard you work, it's never enough?" she asked, her voice low but heavy with emotion. Walter leaned against the counter, his mop resting beside him. "Yeah," he replied simply. Denise laughed bitterly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I work twice as hard as anyone in that room." "And for what? So they can call me aggressive? So they can steal my ideas and get applause for them?" Her voice broke again, and she looked away quickly. Walter stayed quiet for a moment before speaking softly. "It's not your fault," he said firmly. Denise shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. "It feels like it is," she whispered. Walter straightened up and picked up his mop again. "It's not," he repeated gently before walking out of the room, leaving Denise alone with her thoughts. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought in silence, and sometimes silence is all you have left. The hallway was quiet, except for the faint hum of distant conversations. Walter moved slowly, pushing his cart past rows of closed office doors. The muffled sound of laughter echoed from a corner, drawing his attention. Two junior employees stood near the water cooler, their voices low but sharp with tension. "She really went too far this time," one of them whispered, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to overhear. The other nodded, her arms crossed tightly. "Megan's been like this for years. Nobody says anything because Elliot always has her back." Walter paused just out of sight, his hands tightening around the cart's handle. The cracks were showing, not just in Megan's behavior, but in the silence that had protected her. The first employee leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "Did you see what she did to Denise? That was brutal." The second sighed heavily. "Denise deserves better. But what can anyone do? HR won't touch Megan, and Elliot's untouchable." Walter stepped forward slightly, his shadow falling across the wall near them. The employees froze for a moment, their whispers cutting off abruptly as they noticed him. "Hey!" one of them said awkwardly, giving a forced smile before walking away quickly. The other followed without another word, leaving Walter alone in the hallway. Even whispers carried weight in a system built on fear, and fear was how power stayed intact. Walter stood still for a moment longer before putting something down in his small notebook. His resolve hardened with every word he wrote. Walter sat in the dimly lit janitor's closet, the faint smell of cleaning supplies surrounding him. On his lap rested a small, worn notebook, the kind no one would look at twice, but its pages were filled with dates, names, and words that carried the weight of everything he had seen and heard. He flipped to a fresh page, writing with deliberate strokes, "Denise Carter. Idea dismissed. Credited to Elliot Drayton." Below it he added, "Luis Ortega, publicly berated by Megan Trask. Called lazy." Every entry was a brick in the wall they had built around themselves, a wall of arrogance, entitlement, and unchecked power. He turned back to earlier pages, scanning the notes he had taken over the past week. Megan's sneers, Elliot's dismissals, Denise's stifled ideas, Luis's quiet endurance. Each line told a story of a system that had failed its people. Walter paused on one entry. "Megan Trask. They'll hire anyone these days." He underlined it twice before closing the notebook with a soft thud. The door creaked open slightly, and Luis poked his head inside. "You good?" he asked, his voice hesitant but kind. Walter nodded, slipping the notebook into his pocket. "Yeah," he said quietly. Luis lingered for a moment before stepping back out, leaving Walter alone again. This wasn't just about documenting what was broken. It was about building something stronger in its place. Walter exhaled deeply, his fingers brushing over the notebook in his pocket as if drawing strength from it. He stood slowly, picking up his mop and bucket before heading back into the hallway. The supply closet was quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. Walter leaned against the wall, his notebook tucked into his pocket. He was about to leave when Luis Ortega appeared in the doorway, his expression hesitant but determined. "Hey," Luis said softly, stepping inside and glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Walter straightened slightly. "What's up?" Luis hesitated, shifting the weight of the mop bucket in his hand. Then, with a quick glance at the door, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Walter. "What's this?" Walter asked, unfolding it carefully. Luis lowered his voice to a near whisper. "Check the security footage from the supply closet. Last Thursday night." Walter's eyes scanned the note, his brow furrowing as he looked back at Luis. "What am I looking for?" Luis swallowed hard, his voice barely audible now. "Megan. She messed with Denise's project files. I saw her go into the cabinet after hours." Walter's grip on the paper tightened slightly. Luis had spent years keeping his head down, staying silent to survive, but now he was stepping forward, quietly but unmistakably. "Why are you telling me this?" Walter asked carefully. Luis met his gaze for the first time, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Because someone has to," he said simply before turning and walking out of the closet without another word. Walter stood there for a moment, staring at the note in his hand. Sometimes allies don't shout. They whispered just loud enough to be heard. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket before heading toward the security office. The glow of the computer screen illuminated Walter's face as he sat in the quiet office. The security footage Luis had pointed him to confirmed everything. Megan Trask had rifled through Denise's project files late at night, pulling papers and replacing them with altered versions. Walter's jaw tightened as he watched her smirk. On the grainy video before slipping out of the supply closet, he leaned back in the chair, his thoughts racing. It wasn't just arrogance, it was sabotage, and it had been protected by silence. Walter clicked through Denise's employee folder, scanning her performance reviews and project submissions. Then he found it, a draft email saved in her profile, but never sent. Subject: Formal complaint regarding workplace discrimination. Walter opened it carefully, his breath catching as he read. "I have repeatedly experienced dismissal of my ideas and contributions during meetings. I believe this stems from bias against me due to my race and gender." The email was detailed, professional, and damning, but at the bottom it was marked draft. It had never been sent. She had tried to speak up, but something had stopped her. He scrolled further and found a note attached to the file from a colleague. "Don't send this. They'll blacklist you." Walter stared at the screen, his anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. The system hadn't just failed Denise, it had silenced her. He closed the file slowly, his resolve hardening with each passing second. Standing up, he glanced at the security footage one last time before shutting off the computer. This wasn't just about protecting Denise, it was about dismantling the system that had buried voices like hers for years. Walter sat alone in his dimly lit office, a single photo frame resting in his hands. The picture was old, its edges slightly worn. In it, a younger Walter stood proudly beside Hector Ortega, Luis's father, shaking hands in front of the company's first building. Hector's janitor uniform was crisp, his smile genuine. Hector had been one of the first employees he'd hired, a man who worked tirelessly, who believed in the company's promise of respect and fairness. Back then, Walter had promoted him to supervisor, a decision that felt like proof they were building something different. He placed the photo on his desk and opened the notebook he'd been carrying for weeks. The pages were filled with names, dates, and moments, each one a piece of the puzzle he was slowly putting together. His pen hovered over a blank page as he wrote, Hector Ortega, retired early after filing multiple complaints about workplace harassment. Walter leaned back in his chair, staring at the words. Hector had trusted him, had believed in the promise of something better. But somewhere along the way, that promise had been broken. He glanced at the photo again, his eyes lingering on Hector's face. Then his mind shifted to Luis, Hector's son, still enduring the same dismissals and disrespect decades later. The weight of it all pressed down on him. This wasn't just about Megan or Elliot or even Denise. It was about every person who had been silenced, erased, or ignored while he wasn't paying attention. Walter stood slowly, placing the photo back on the shelf. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window. A man determined to make things right. The conference room was buzzing with quiet chatter, the hum of conversations blending with the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. Walter Gaines stepped inside, his tailored suit sharp, his presence commanding. The room fell silent instantly. Gasps rippled through the crowd as employees recognized him. Megan Trask froze mid-sentence, her coffee cup trembling slightly in her hand. Elliot Drayton's face paled as he slowly lowered himself into his chair, his usual confidence draining away. The power dynamic shifted in a single step. The invisible janitor was now the CEO, and the room knew it. Walter walked to the front of the room, his gaze sweeping over the employees like a storm rolling in. Megan's chair scraped loudly as she stood abruptly, her voice shaky but desperate. "Sir, I didn't know." Walter raised a hand, cutting her off without raising his voice. "Sit down, Ms. Trask." The command was quiet but left no room for argument. Megan sank back into her seat, her knuckles white against the armrest as she gripped it tightly. Elliot avoided eye contact entirely, staring fixedly at the table as if it might provide an escape. For years, they'd hidden behind titles and protocols. Now there was nowhere to hide. Walter adjusted his cufflinks slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. When he spoke again, his tone was sharp, but measured. "You're probably wondering why I called this meeting." The room stayed silent, tension thickening with every second that passed. Walter paused deliberately, letting their unease settle like dust after a storm. This wasn't just a reveal. It was a reckoning. The silence in the room was suffocating. Walter stood at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on Megan and Elliot. The employees around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stealing glances at one another but saying nothing. Walter's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Megan Trask, Elliot Drayton, step forward." Megan's breath hitched audibly. She hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it might anchor her. "Sir, I didn't know." Walter's expression didn't change. "What? I was watching? That I was listening?" His tone was calm, but each word landed with precision. "That doesn't excuse what I heard or saw." Elliot cleared his throat, his fingers fidgeting with the pen in front of him. "If I may?" Walter turned his gaze to him sharply, silencing him mid-sentence. "You'll speak when I ask you to." The authority they had wielded so carelessly was now slipping through their fingers, replaced by a quiet but undeniable judgment. Megan finally stood, her movements stiff and hesitant. "Sir," she began again, her voice trembling slightly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Walter tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "A misunderstanding," he repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. Megan faltered under his stare. I never meant any harm," she stammered weakly. Walter leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower but gaining weight. "Intent doesn't erase impact, Ms. Trask." The room stayed silent as Megan sat back down abruptly, her face pale and her hands trembling in her lap. For the first time, they weren't in control, and they knew it. Walter stood at the head of the room, his presence heavy as the silence stretched. Megan and Elliot sat stiffly, their faces pale, their confidence unraveling with each passing second. Walter reached for the remote on the table and pointed it at the screen behind him. "Let's watch something together," he said evenly. his tone calm but cutting. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy security footage from the break room. Megan appeared on the video, standing over Luis Ortega as he mopped a spill. Her voice rang out clearly. "Lazy? Clean it yourself." Gasps rippled through the room as employees exchanged uneasy glances. Megan's face turned red, her lips trembling as she stared at the screen. Her sneer dissolved into a trembling lip as the screen reflected her cruelty back at her. The video continued, showing Megan walking away with a smirk. Walter paused the footage and turned back to face the room. "This is what you call leadership?" he asked, his voice sharp but measured. Megan opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Elliot shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze fixed on the table as if it might shield him from what was coming next. Walter pressed play again, showing another clip. Elliot interrupting Denise Carter during a meeting, dismissing her ideas only to praise a white colleague moments later for repeating them. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Walter paused the video once more and placed the remote down deliberately. Their power had been built on silence, but now that silence was breaking. Walter's voice cut through again. "This isn't leadership. This is entitlement, and it ends today." The room was heavy with tension, the air thick and unmoving. Walter stood at the head of the table, his gaze unwavering as Megan and Elliot sat frozen in their chairs. The screen behind him was dark now, but its echoes lingered in the eyes of every employee. Elliot finally broke the silence, his voice shaky but attempting control. "Sir, I think you're misinterpreting this. We didn't mean—" Walter's hand slammed a thick folder onto the table, cutting him off mid-sentence. The sound reverberated through the room like a gavel striking judgment. "Intent doesn't erase impact," Walter said firmly, his voice low but piercing. He opened the folder slowly, revealing pages of complaints, each one stamped, "Dismissed." Megan shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. I never meant to hurt anyone," she stammered weakly. Walter's gaze turned to her, sharp and unforgiving. "You didn't mean to humiliate Luis Ortega in front of an entire room? You didn't mean to dismiss Denise Carter's ideas while praising someone else for stealing them?" For years, they had used intent as a shield, but now that shield was crumbling. Walter flipped through the pages deliberately, his movement slow and deliberate. "Every complaint is buried, every voice silenced, and you want me to believe it wasn't intentional?" The room fell silent again, employees exchanging uneasy glances but saying nothing. The walls they had built around themselves were closing in, and there was no way out. Walter leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, but final. "This isn't about what you meant. It's about what you did." Walter let the silence settle, his gaze steady on Megan and Elliot. The weight of his words hung in the room like a storm about to break. Employees sat frozen, their eyes darting between the two and the man standing at the head of the table. "This company was built on respect," Walter began, his voice calm but unyielding. "For every employee, at every level. But you—" he pointed at Megan and Elliot, his tone sharpening. "You've turned it into something ugly." Megan's breath hitched audibly. "Sir, I can fix this," she said quickly, her voice trembling as she leaned forward slightly. "I'll do better, I promise." Walter didn't blink. "You've had years to do better." Elliot tried to interject, his voice tight with desperation. "We didn't know it was this serious." Walter's hand came up, silencing him with a single gesture. "Serious?" he repeated, his tone cutting like glass. "It's serious when employees feel invisible in their own workplace. It's serious when complaints are buried to protect people like you." Megan's hands shook as she reached for her coffee cup, but she didn't drink from it. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Please, I didn't mean—" Walter's voice rose slightly, not in anger but in finality. "Enough." He turned toward security standing by the door. "Escort them out." The room was deathly quiet as Megan's badge clattered onto the table, her hands trembling as she stood. Elliot followed suit, his shoulders hunched in defeat. As he avoided everyone's gaze, the power they had wielded so carelessly was gone, replaced by silence and shame. As they were led out of the room, Walter spoke one last time. "You're fired." The door closed behind Megan and Elliot, the sound echoing faintly in the now silent conference room. Employees sat motionless, their gazes fixed on the empty chairs where the two had been moments ago. Walter remained standing at the head of the table, his presence heavy but calm. He scanned the room, letting the silence linger. This wasn't just about firing them. It was about breaking the silence that had protected them for years. A junior staffer near the back leaned toward her colleague, her voice barely above a whisper. "They deserved it," she murmured. The other employee nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "It was overdue," he replied quietly. Walter caught their words but didn't react outwardly. Instead, he placed his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "This isn't just about Megan or Elliot," he said evenly, his voice carrying through the room like a ripple in still water. "It's about all of us. And what we let happen here." The employees exchanged uneasy glances, some nodding faintly while others stared at their hands. Loyalty to power had crumbled into collective judgment, and judgment was louder than any defense. Walter straightened up and adjusted his cufflinks before stepping away from the table. "Change starts now," he said, his tone firm but restrained. He walked toward the door. The room remained silent, but the air was charged with something new, something heavier than guilt and more powerful than fear. For the first time, silence wasn't complicity, it was accountability. The newsroom buzzed with activity as reporters pieced together the story. On every screen, the headline blazed in bold letters. "CEO fires executives over discrimination. Scandal." Clips of Walter's speech played on repeat, his calm but cutting words echoing across social media platforms. A video of the conference room surfaced online, showing Walter standing tall at the head of the table. His voice was steady as he said, "Intent doesn't erase impact. This ends today." The video racked up millions of views within hours, shared under hashtags like Justice at Work and Lead by Example. What began as a quiet reckoning inside one company had erupted into a public demand for accountability. In a small apartment, Luis Ortega sat on the couch with his daughter beside him. She held a tablet, scrolling through the comments under the video. "Look, Papi," she said excitedly, pointing at the screen. "Finally, someone's doing something," she read aloud from one comment. "This is what leadership looks like." Luis nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen. His voice was soft but steady as he said, "It's about time." Elsewhere, Denise Carter sat at her desk, watching the same video on her phone. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply as Walter's words replayed in her mind. For years, she had fought to be heard. Now her silence was no longer a burden. It was a choice. The news continued to spread like wildfire. Anchors debated the implications of Walter's actions while employees and other companies whispered about their own experiences. One act of justice had sparked a movement, and there was no stopping it now. The living room was small but warm, the faint glow of the television casting soft shadows on the walls. Luis Ortega sat on the worn couch, his daughter nestled beside him, her tablet balanced on her knees. On the screen, Walter's speech played again, his voice steady and deliberate. "Intent doesn't erase impact. This ends today." Luis stared at the screen, his hands resting on his lap. His daughter turned to him, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Is the bad lady gone?" she asked softly, her voice breaking through the quiet. Luis nodded slowly, his throat tightening as he tried to speak. "Yeah, mija," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "She's gone." His daughter smiled faintly before turning back to the tablet, scrolling through the comments under the video. "Look at this one," she said excitedly, pointing at the screen. "Finally, someone stood up for us." Luis leaned forward, slightly, his eyes scanning the words that filled the screen. For years, he had felt invisible, his work unnoticed, his voice unheard. But now, for the first time, he felt seen. His daughter rested her head against his arm, her small gesture grounding him in the moment. Luis exhaled deeply, a single tear slipping down his cheek as he whispered to himself, "It's about time." Luis didn't need applause or recognition. He needed dignity. And today, he reclaimed it. The television continued to play Walter's speech as Luis sat silently beside his daughter. The weight of years spent in silence lifted slightly from his shoulders. The office was quiet, the faint hum of a desk lamp breaking the stillness. Denise Carter sat at her desk, her phone resting beside her. On the screen, Walter's speech played. Again, his voice calm but resolute. "This isn't just about Megan or Elliot. It's about all of us and what we let happen here." Denise leaned back in her chair, her fingers brushing against the edges of a crisp white envelope on her desk. Inside was her promotion letter, Director of Operations. She had read it 3 times already, but the weight of it hadn't fully settled. For years, she had fought to be seen, to be heard. Every meeting, every idea dismissed, every moment stolen had left its mark. But now she wasn't just surviving, she was leading. She picked up the envelope again, running her fingers over the embossed company logo. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her phone buzzed softly, with a notification. Another message from a colleague congratulating her on the promotion. Denise set the phone down without replying, her mind drifting back to the moments that had brought her here, the humiliation, the silence, the quiet battles fought in break rooms and hallways. She exhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a moment before whispering to herself, "It's enough." This wasn't just about recognition, it was about reclaiming space that had been denied for too long. Denise placed the envelope back on her desk and straightened up in her chair. The weight on her shoulders felt lighter now. The office was unusually quiet, the hum of computers and faint chatter replaced by an uneasy stillness. Walter walked slowly through the rows of cubicles, his eyes scanning the space. 2 desks stood out, empty, stripped bare of their usual clutter. Megan Trask's desk was spotless now, her nameplate removed, her chair pushed neatly under the table. The faint outline of a coffee ring on the surface was the only trace she had left behind. Elliot Drayton's desk was similarly barren, his files packed away, his once prized executive pen set gone. Power didn't just disappear, it left echoes, and these empty desks were louder than any apology could ever be. A janitor, not Walter, stood nearby, sweeping debris into a dustpan labeled "Past Mistakes." He glanced at Walter briefly before returning to his work, his movements slow but deliberate. 2 junior employees passed by, their voices low but sharp with judgment. "She thought she was untouchable," one muttered, nodding toward Megan's desk. The other shook his head. "Not anymore," he replied softly. Walter paused near Megan's desk, his gaze lingering on the empty space where her nameplate had been. For years, these desks had been symbols of unchecked power, spaces where entitlement thrived and voices were silenced. Now they were reminders of what happens when accountability finally arrives. He turned and walked toward the window at the end of the hallway, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. Empty desks didn't mean an end. They meant a beginning. The janitor finished sweeping and walked away quietly, leaving behind nothing but clean floors and silence. The apartment was dim, the only light coming from Megan's laptop screen. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands gripping her coffee cup tightly, though the coffee had long gone cold. On the screen, headlines blazed in bold letters. "Discrimination exposed. CEO fires top executives." Megan scrolled through the articles, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Each headline felt like a slap. Entitlement unraveled. A reckoning at Gaines Industries. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, protected by her position, by the silence of those around her. But now, there was no protection left. She clicked on a video embedded in one of the articles. Walter's voice filled the room. "Intent doesn't erase impact. This ends today." Megan flinched slightly, her grip tightening on the cup as she paused the video. Her gaze drifted to a framed photo sitting on the counter, a company gala from 2 years ago. In it, she stood beside Walter, smiling brightly as she held an award for excellence in leadership. Her smile now felt frozen, distant, like it belonged to someone else entirely. That version of herself, the confident leader, the respected executive, felt like a stranger now. Megan set the cup down and leaned back in her chair, exhaling shakily. The silence in the room was deafening, pressing against her like a weight she couldn't lift. She closed the laptop slowly and stared at the photo again. For years, she had silenced others to protect herself. Now, silence was all she had left. The living room was quiet, the faint ticking of a clock filling the stillness. Megan sat on the floor beside an open box, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through an old photo album. The glossy pages felt heavier than they should, each one carrying a memory she wasn't sure she wanted to revisit. She stopped on a photo from a leadership event 5 years ago. In it, she stood tall beside Walter Gaines, shaking his hand as cameras flashed around them. Her smile was wide, her posture confident. Walter's expression was warm but measured, his handshake firm. Back then, she believed she was untouchable. Oh, rising star in the company, someone who could do no wrong. She traced her finger over Walter's face in the photo, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I thought I had it all figured out," she whispered to herself. The next page showed another event, a team-building retreat where Megan stood at the center of a group of employees. She was laughing in the photo, her arm draped casually over Elliot's shoulder. Luis Ortega stood near the edge of the group, his smile faint but polite. Megan hadn't even noticed him back then. Even her memories felt tainted now, filled with moments she had ignored and people she had dismissed. Megan closed the album abruptly and leaned back against the wall, her breath uneven. She stared at the box of photos for a long moment before pushing it aside with her foot. The past wasn't just behind her, it was catching up to her, and there was no escaping it. The conference room was filled with employees, their murmurs quieting as Walter Gaines stepped to the front. His tailored suit was sharp, his presence commanding. A large screen behind him displayed the words, "Accountability begins here." Janitor adjusted the microphone slightly, his voice steady but firm as he began. For years, voices in this company have been silenced, complaints ignored, concerns dismissed. The room stayed silent, employees exchanging hesitant glances. Walter's gaze swept over them, his tone softening but gaining weight. "That ends today." He gestured to the screen, where a new initiative was outlined, anonymous reporting system. Every voice matters. "No voice will go unheard again," Walter said, his words deliberate. "This system ensures that every employee has a safe space to speak up without fear of retaliation." A few employees nodded faintly, their expressions shifting from doubt to cautious hope. It wasn't just a policy, it was a promise. Walter paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," he continued. "It's about building something better." A woman near the back raised her hand hesitantly. "Will it actually work?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the skepticism of years spent unheard. Walter met her gaze directly. "It will," he said simply, "because I'll make sure it does." The system wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need. Walter stepped back from the microphone as the room erupted into quiet murmurs again. Employees exchanged glances, some skeptical, others hopeful. But the shift had begun. The conference room was filled with employees seated in neat rows, their postures stiff and uncertain. A facilitator stood at the front, her voice calm, but firm as she introduced the session. On the screen behind her, bold letters read, "Mandatory bias training, recognize, reflect, reform." Walter sat quietly in the back, his presence understated but deliberate. He watched as employees exchanged uneasy glances, some fidgeting with pens or tapping their feet. Change wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. The facilitator stepped forward, her tone steady but direct. "How many of you have witnessed microaggressions in the workplace but stayed silent?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Slowly, hesitantly, hands began to rise. First one, then another, until nearly half the room had their hands in the air. The first step to change wasn't action, it was admitting there was a problem. The facilitator nodded, her expression neutral but thoughtful. "And how many of you have been on the receiving end of those microaggressions?" This time, fewer hands rose, but the weight of those raised was palpable. Denise Carter's hand was among them, her gaze steady, despite the vulnerability it carried. Walter's jaw tightened slightly as he watched her. For years, voices like Denise's had been drowned out by silence and complicity. Today they were being heard. The facilitator gestured to the screen again. "Bias isn't always loud," she said softly. "Sometimes it's quiet, hidden in assumptions and unspoken rules, but it's always harmful." The room fell silent again as employees absorbed her words. The hardest truths weren't shouted, they were whispered into spaces that didn't want to hear them. The meeting room was quiet, the usual hum of side conversations replaced by a focused stillness. Denise Carter stood at the front, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. Her team sat before her, their eyes fixed on her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "We're not just fixing policies," she began, her voice calm but firm. "We're fixing culture." The words hung in the air for a moment, their weight settling over the room. Denise scanned the faces of her team, some nodding in agreement, others watching her with quiet curiosity. For years, she had been dismissed, overlooked, and silenced. But now, she wasn't just part of the conversation, she was leading it. She glanced at her notes briefly before continuing. "This isn't going to be easy," she admitted. "Change never is, but it's necessary." A hand went up near the back of the room. A younger employee with a hesitant expression asked softly, "What if people don't want to change?" Denise met his gaze directly, her tone unwavering. "Then we show them why it matters," she replied. "We lead by example." She wasn't asking for permission. She was setting the standard. As she continued outlining her plans for the department, her voice grew steadier, more confident. The team leaned in, their skepticism giving way to cautious respect. When she finished speaking, there was a beat of silence before quiet applause filled the room. Denise stepped back from the podium, exhaling deeply as a small smile crossed her face. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was leading. The auditorium was alive with quiet murmurs as employees filled the seats, the soft hum of anticipation hanging in the air. On stage, a banner read, "Employee Appreciation Event, Honoring Excellence." Luis Ortega sat near the back, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had never been comfortable in crowds, but today felt different. Walter stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding yet calm. He adjusted the microphone slightly before speaking. "Today, we're here to celebrate those who make this company what it is," he began, his voice steady. "Not just those at the top, but those who keep us grounded." Luis shifted in his seat, his heart pounding as Walter's eyes scanned the crowd. "One such person has been with us for years, working tirelessly, often without recognition. But today, that changes." Walter paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "Luis Ortega, please join me on stage." The room erupted into applause as Luis froze momentarily, his breath catching in his throat. For years he had felt invisible, his work unnoticed, his voice unheard. But now he was being seen. He stood slowly, making his way to the stage as Walter extended a hand toward him. Luis shook it firmly, his grip steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. Walter handed him a small plaque engraved with his name and years of service. Luis stared at it for a moment before stepping to the microphone. His voice was soft but clear as he said, "Thank you for seeing me." It wasn't about the plaque. It was about reclaiming dignity that had been denied for too long. Luis stepped off the stage to another round of applause, his daughter beaming proudly from the front row. The newsroom buzzed with activity, the glow of monitors reflecting headlines that seemed to echo everywhere. The Gaines Initiative, a new standard for corporate accountability. A news anchor's voice filled the air, calm but firm. Walter Gaines's reforms at his company have sparked a wave of change across industries, she reported. Other CEOs are now adopting similar measures, including anonymous reporting systems and mandatory bias training. Clips from Walter's speech played on the screen. Leadership isn't about power. It's about accountability. The anchor continued. The initiative has been praised as a groundbreaking move toward workplace equity. What began as a quiet reckoning inside one company had erupted into an industry-wide movement. In a small office miles away, a group of employees gathered around a computer, watching the news. One of them, a young woman, turned to her colleague. "Do you think our company will do something like this?" she asked hesitantly. The man shrugged but nodded slowly. "They'll have to," he said. "People aren't staying quiet anymore." Meanwhile, in another corporate boardroom, an executive leaned back in his chair as he watched Walter's speech on his phone. He sighed heavily before turning to his team. "We need to talk about making some changes," he said reluctantly. The ripple effect wasn't just in policies, it was in conversations that had been avoided for too long. Back at Gaines Industries, Walter stood by his office window, watching. Employees moved through the lobby below. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, steady and resolute. One act of justice had sparked something bigger than he could have imagined, and it was only the beginning. The office was quiet, the usual hum of conversations replaced by an uneasy stillness. Walter walked slowly through the rows of cubicles, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. His gaze lingered on two desks, empty, stripped bare of their usual clutter. Megan Trask's desk stood out, its surface spotless, her nameplate gone. The faint outline of a coffee ring marked the spot where her cup had always rested. Elliot. Drayton's desk was similarly barren, his chair pushed neatly under the table, his once prized executive pen set missing. Power didn't just disappear, it left echoes, and these empty desks were louder than any apology could ever be. A janitor, not Walter, stood nearby, sweeping debris into a dustpan labeled "Past Mistakes." He worked quietly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Walter sat alone in his office, the quiet hum of the city outside barely audible through the thick glass windows. The desk was neat, almost too neat, save for a single framed photo resting near the edge. He picked it up slowly, his fingers brushing against the worn edges of the frame. In the photo, a younger Walter stood proudly beside Hector Ortega, Luis's father. They were outside the company's first building, shaking hands. Walter's smile was wide, full of hope and ambition. Hector's janitor uniform was crisp, his expression warm but humble. Hector had been one of the first employees he'd hired, a man who worked tirelessly and believed in the promise of something better. He placed the photo back on the desk and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. The weight of the past pressed against him like a silent accusation. Walter opened his notebook, flipping through pages filled with dates, names, and moments he had documented over the past weeks. His pen hovered over a blank page before he wrote, "Hector Ortega, retired early after filing multiple complaints about workplace harassment." He stared at the words for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly. Hector had trusted him, had believed in the promise of respect and dignity. But somewhere along the way, that promise had been broken. Walter glanced at the photo again, his eyes lingering on Hector's face. Then his mind shifted to Luis, still enduring the same dismissals and disrespect decades later. The past wasn't just a memory, it was a reminder of what needed to change. Walter stood slowly, placing the photo back on the shelf before turning toward the window. The stage was set in a grand hall, the air buzzing with anticipation. Industry leaders, journalists, and employees from across the country filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the podium at the center. Walter Gaines stood behind it, his posture steady, his expression calm but resolute. He adjusted the microphone slightly, letting the murmurs settle into silence. His voice carried through the room, clear and deliberate. "Leadership isn't about power," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "It's about accountability." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Walter paused, letting them sink in before continuing. "For too long we've allowed systems to protect those at the top, while silencing those at the bottom. That ends now." A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the audience, nodding heads, thoughtful expressions. This wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. Walter's tone softened slightly as he leaned forward. "Accountability isn't about blame, it's about growth. It's about creating spaces where every voice matters, where dignity isn't conditional." In the audience, Denise Carter sat near the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her was Luis Ortega, his daughter, sitting proudly next to him. Both listened intently, their expressions filled with quiet pride. Walter glanced briefly in their direction before concluding, "True leadership is measured not by what we build, but by what we're willing to rebuild when we fail." The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation sweeping through the crowd. This wasn't just about one company, it was about redefining what leadership could be. As Walter stepped back from the podium, he caught Denise's and Luis's eyes in the crowd. They nodded at him, silent but powerful acknowledgments of everything they had fought for.